This is Keith Risher, the founder of Keith RN, a website that I created over 3 years ago to create clinical reasoning resources for both students as well as nurse educators. I've spoken across the country at both national and regional nurse educator conferences and student assemblies the past 3 years, where I share practical approaches to strengthen student learning through an emphasis of clinical reasoning. I'm excited to share my first webinar series titled Strengthening Student Transition to Real-World Clinical Practice that will help students successfully launch and transition more smoothly to real-world clinical practice after they graduate, pass the NCLEX, and start their first nursing position. I also have a free download included with today's video titled Clinical Lab Values and Nursing Responsibilities that will include some of the topic content that we'll be talking about in today's webinar. But when we look at students and as they transition and enter their first position as a nurse, reality shock is very real for them. Now, reality shock is simply defined as the differences between what they've been taught and the values that they see in the clinical culture that will likely collide and be different. And how will the student respond in that situation? Another way to look at it is the lived experience when you enter the profession, but now find yourself unprepared, or at least feeling unprepared. It's important to realize that as a student, you know that most students have 1 to 2 patients most of their time in nursing education in the clinical setting. That will not be the reality once you graduate. Students will have 3, 4, 5, 6, even more patients depending on the clinical setting. How will you manage the reality of that with priority setting, time management, and all that goes with it? This is another component of reality shock. If a student is not well prepared to multitask and priority set in this reality, it will cause a high degree of stress. The consequence, though, to students is simply this: who are now a new nurse, some may find it unmanageable and will even leave the profession of nursing entirely as a result because of the stress, lack of support, the poor nurse-to-physician relationships, the workloads, uncivil work environments, and difficulty transitioning to practice. My goal in creating this webinar series is that I do not want that to be your lived reality, but I want to share some practical strategies to maximize your learning while you are yet a student in school that will better prepare you for clinical practice. But let's talk about the reality of nursing education. There's a lot of stress and there's a lot of struggles that nursing students currently experience within nursing education. I recently taught a NCLEX preparation class from schools all around the Twin Cities, and I asked these students, what was your greatest struggle or frustration while you were in nursing school, and what would you do to improve that experience? These were some of their unfiltered comments. Classes were not relevant to practice. There was too much memorizing of facts and too little application and how and what to apply to clinical practice. Teach the most important topics to form a strong knowledge base. Overload of information. I felt overwhelmed. We get so much information and thousands of pages to read, it is not possible to know it all. Another student said this: we spend way too much time with care plans and not enough learning about patient care and what is most important in the clinical setting. And I would say for myself, as I look at that experience, I have seen those same frustrations with the students that I too have taught in academia. But my story is such is that I'm a newer nurse educator in the last several years. I really consider myself an everyday educator, not unlike any of you who may be watching who are also nurse educators, whether you be in the clinical, classroom, or both. I've been a nurse for over 30 years in a wide variety of settings, including critical care, ER, and circulating rapid response, where I currently practice in the float pool of a large metropolitan hospital here in the Twin Cities. But what motivated me to really pursue academia was really the essence of pursuing my passion. I had a choice about 10 years ago as I was teaching and mentoring new nurses in the emergency department. I realized how much I enjoyed transmitting the knowledge that I've acquired over my years of clinical experience. But I also had an opportunity to also go to nursing anesthesia school, where I felt that I could earn 6 figures, I could support my family quite nicely, pay off debt, and basically make that the priority. But I shadowed a nurse anesthetist for a day and realized this was not clearly my passion, though I could make a lot of money in the process. At the same time, I was reading a book by a Christian author, John Eldredge, called Wild at Heart. And he had this quote that jumped off the page that was relevant for me at that time in my life, as well as for many of you, whether you are a student or a nurse educator. And this is what he wrote. He said, "Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive and do that, because what the world needs are people who have come fully alive." But this quote gave me permission to pursue what I believe is my God-given passion and talent in nursing, the ability to teach. So after completing my baccalaureate, instead of pursuing the path of what I thought was needed and would be most relevant in making lots of money, I pursued my passion and went straight into nursing education and pursued my master's in that major instead. But after my second year of classroom teaching, I began to feel disillusioned and discouraged. From my perspective, there was a clear disconnect between the realities of clinical practice and the traditional model of nursing education. I continued to work part-time in clinical practice and never left the bedside. And so this gap, which is now formally called the education practice gap, became very apparent and very evident in my lived experience. The content presented in the classroom and those that I watched of my fellow colleagues in Skills Lab had little contextualization to practice. Classroom lectures were content heavy, and students were clearly burdened and highly stressed. Well, everything changed over winter break in 2011 when I read Educating Nurses, a call for radical transformation. This was the summary of the Carnegie Foundation's work on researching nurse education programs across the country, and realized that there truly was trouble in paradise. This book advocated that clinical reasoning and other ways of nurse thinking must be emphasized, and classroom content needed to be decreased, simplified, and contextualized to practice. This captured so concisely the root of my discontent that I knew I needed to do things differently. So I spent the last half of my winter break reworking my traditional content-heavy PowerPoint presentations and applied these paradigm changes to my classroom. By using the best practice recommendations of educating nurses in my class, I'm going to share what I've learned in this journey, as any educator can do the same and improve your learning in your program and help your students in the process successfully transition to real-world clinical practice. I'll share the rest of my story in the next 2 videos, and how my unique approach to applied clinical reasoning can help smooth this bump out for students in the clinical setting. But let's talk briefly about educating nurses, a call for radical transformation. Their greatest criticism was that nursing education is content heavy. There's TMI in nursing education, and as a result, that impacts student learning, because instead of getting the deep learning of what is most important, they get a superficial or skin-deep knowledge of a broad body of content that basically limits their ability to apply and to use this knowledge in the clinical setting. And there's 3 different aspects that need to be emphasized if we're going to transform nursing education as well as improve the learning of our students. First, we need to teach for salience or situated cognition. And I simply would use that verbiage as simply saying this: if you're a nurse educator, contextualize your content. Students must see why the information you're presenting is relevant to nursing education and to the bedside. Nursing is a practice-based profession, so it's imperative that everything that is done in the classroom, simulation, whatever the setting, is contextualized to clinical practice. Second thing that educating nurses discussed is the importance of integrating classroom and clinical learning. In essence, we must bring clinical to the classroom and bring the salience of this reality to our classrooms and simulations so students again can see why it is relevant. In most programs, we have classroom theory and clinical setting in the hospital or acute care or transitional care settings, whatever it might be, and these spheres rarely intersect. That needs to change if we're going to truly transform our programs as well as improve the learning of our students. And the final aspect that must be integrated into nursing education is clinical reasoning must be emphasized. And clinical reasoning must be understood, multiple definitions in the literature. I really value the perspective of Patricia Benner and what she has written in Educating Nurses, as well as her book Clinical Wisdom and Nursing Interventions in 2011. But her definition captures the essence of applied nurse thinking to practice. This is what she said. Clinical reasoning is the ability of 5 different components. The ability first to think in action and reason as a situation changes over time. Secondly, to capture and understand the significance of clinical trends. Third, filter this clinical data to recognize what is most and least important, then grasp the essence of the current situation, and then make a judgment or decision: is an actual problem present? And I think it's important to recognize this as I shared these transformational paradigm shifts that nursing education must embrace. These transformational characteristics are essential because they equal a successful transition to student learning. When we contextualize content, bring clinical to class, emphasize clinical reasoning as nurse thinking, these aspects of practice will better prepare our students for real-world clinical practice. And I'll be sharing how we can practically share not only this information, but as well as what is most important regarding the content that students must be able to master and know deeply to recognize their need to transition successfully to practice. I'm going to talk about 3 different things: pathophysiology, pharmacology, and fluid and electrolytes briefly. What students must know well is anatomy and physiology. This aspect is not merely a prerequisite that is just done before they enter into the program and then they can kind of forget about it. Patho is relevant to everything that a nurse does in practice. And so therefore it's important that our students recognize it, and that as educators we situate this when we expect our students to understand and to state in their own words the mechanism of action, being able to state this in their own words, as well as the primary problem of the patients they care for. Do they understand the pathophysiology, for example, of a patient with heart failure who presented with shortness of breath and a weight gain of several pounds over the last 3 days and has pitting edema in the lower extremities? Recognizing, is this right-sided failure, left-sided failure, or biventricular failure? These nuances and this deep knowledge of pathophysiology will strengthen and deepen the critical thinking so that students are able to use their knowledge, not just merely memorize facts. Another component that students must know deeply is pharmacology. Pharmacology is something that students will pass medications every day, and they therefore must have a deep understanding of the most important aspects of pharmacology. From my perspective as a practicing nurse, I really value the importance of understanding in my own words the mechanism of action. It is not enough for a student to simply state, oh, atenolol, that's a beta blocker, and say you're safe to pass. And as long as they can say the safe dose and other recommendations, they must know what is a beta blocker blocking. When a student has that level of knowledge, they will be able to translate that and recognize that if they understand that a beta blocker is blocking beta 1 stimulation to the heart, which is sympathetic nervous system stimulation, you will as a result have lowered heart rate and lowered blood pressure. And those assessments must be done before and even maybe after the medication is given. So when the mechanism of action through a knowledge of pathophysiology is deeply understood, students will have that deeper knowledge that will translate to the critical thinking and using this knowledge in clinical practice. Third aspect of content that I believe is imperative to deep learning of most important is fluids and electrolytes. But this is much more than just the hypo and the hypers of the most important electrolytes such as sodium, potassium, magnesium, etc. That alone and memorizing those facts will not prepare a student for professional practice. They must recognize the importance of what are the nursing considerations, for example, if my sodium is 120? What is the pathophysiologic impact to the brain? Could cerebral edema be a risk if they're severely hyponatremic for whatever the reason might be? And recognizing that students must be able to apply the knowledge of fluid and electrolytes to the clinical setting by recognizing what nursing assessments and other interventions may be required as a result of an abnormal lab value. Now, my students struggled with this content as well because it's not taught intentionally in many of the textbooks of fluid and electrolyte. It's more of an applied knowledge that nurses in practice utilize. I kind of use this concept of lab planning, that you can create a plan of care around an abnormal relevant lab, such as a potassium that is 3.0. What are they at risk for? What does the nurse need to be assessing for? And I created a worksheet on lab values and nursing responsibilities. It is a free download, kind of a skinny of a need to know on fluid electrolytes, of the hypos and hypers of the most important labs, as well as electrolytes, and more importantly, the nursing assessments that must be on the radar of the bedside nurse to provide safe clinical care. And that's my gift to you, and I want you to use that download and help strengthen your knowledge. If you're a student or even a nurse educator, help your students with this very important knowledge to practice. But nursing is much more than just knowing the right things. Students must think the right things and must be able to think like a nurse. And in reality, nurse thinking is very complex. It really is much more than nursing process, though that's foundational to practice. But nursing and thinking like a nurse involves also the critical thinking, identifying clinical relationships and patterns of clinical data in the clinical setting, as well as clinical reasoning and how we've defined that. In reality, the nurse is a knowledge worker who needs to use that knowledge to translate into safe and effective care. And as we look at, in closing, every student needs a mentor. And students and new nurses need a mentor, a Yoda, to guide and nurture them in the clinical setting. Now, hopefully this can be done and be started right in nursing school with nursing faculty who can be that guide and mentor, as well as a nurse in practice or a relevant resource that is written. Of these content areas that I have shared in this first video, what do you think is the number one and greatest struggle that students experience and battle with the most? There is one that really stands out. But more importantly, how can this current weakness be strengthened will be the topic of my next video. I'll be sending out my next blog on Monday, and I look forward to seeing you then. So what did you think of today's webinar? Please share your thoughts and questions on my blog that is included with this webinar, and would value your feedback. And if you have a question, I will directly answer on that blog for everyone to see. So I look forward to sharing my next video shortly and look forward to seeing you then. Thank you for your time and coming.